morning. Happy Monday, September 30th. We have a really exciting Hispanic Heritage Month forum for you all today. So in preparation for our guest speaker, if you'll please put your phones out of sight, out of mind. And if you have any AirPods in, go ahead and take them out. Front row seat. Perfect. All right, so Professora Nananer and I are super excited to introduce you to our guest speaker for the day. Her name is Aidee Farias. Please give her a huge round of applause as a welcome. And we are going to intro this a little bit for you to talk a little bit about Hispanic Heritage Month and this idea of heritage as well.
Okay, so for many of you, this is probably a repetition, right, of a little bit of information, but I think it's really important to remember the whys behind things. So for today, it's celebrated from September 15th, a couple weeks ago through October 15th. Does anyone know why? It coincides with many independences, in addition to Mexico, other countries, especially in Central America and then also in Chile. So we have a lot of independence. It honors the histories, cultures, and contributions of American citizens whose ancestors came from Spain, Mexico, the Caribbean, Central and South America. So the word Hispanic, right, has to do with people who speak the Spanish language. The celebration starts mid-September because it coincides with the National Independence Days, as I just said. So this is something that, even though it might look like, oh, it appears on the calendar, we're trying to honor things in different ways by introducing you to different perspectives, and that's what we hope to impart today.
So as we go through our presentation today and our activity later this afternoon, if you'll keep in mind this larger question, why is it important to learn about different histories and cultures? Why is it on the calendar, and why are we making space for it within our schedule? And we'll talk about this a little bit more at the end of today. But today our focus really is on this idea of duality of heritage. So what is it that makes you who you are? And today we're going to explore two parts of heritage, two parts of who a person is. The first is the history and trauma of a group of people, and that is the focus of our presentation this morning. And the second thing we need to consider is also the culture and traditions of a group of people as well. So this afternoon during lunch, we're going to have a guest instructor come in and give us some salsa dancing lessons at lunch. And we're also going to have Cafe Guarani come in and serve some Paraguayan empanadas as well. So we're going to explore both elements, both aspects of heritage today as we talk about Hispanic Heritage Month.
Okay, so if we all think about what is folded into our heritage, there's a lot of commonalities, right? We have, let's say, these food items, one of which are empanadas. There are many different varieties of empanadas. Today's will be the Paraguay, but we have a lot of similarities in different countries, and I'm sure in your families you might have a food that has something that is folded into some sort of doughy ingredient, right? So we have maybe a gyoza, a samosa, pierogi, or ravioli, or maybe a calzone. And so that's the idea, is what connects us to other cultures and also what makes us different, but what are those stories and how can we start to take away those layers of that dough and get inside and really, I guess you want to say like taste, but savor what makes us different, what makes us unique, and what are our common bonds. And I think we're going to find that there's a lot more we have in common than different, but we can also celebrate those differences. So what is heritage? I don't know if anyone has a good definition here, but let's just go with the dictionary's definition for now. So Oxford Languages defines heritage as valued objects and qualities such as cultural traditions, unspoiled countryside and historic buildings that have been passed down from previous generations. So dictionary.com says something that is handed down from the past as a tradition. So if we think about family and cultural heritage, what are some words that come to mind to you? So we want you to be thinking about that as you hear our guest speaker today. And so right now we're going to transition to Aidee Farias. Give her a big round of applause.
Thank you so much for the invitation to be here. Again, my name is Aidee Farias. I am Nico's mom. This is not his fault. Okay, so he did not think of this idea, but I'm so very honored and lucky to be here to share a little bit about my heritage and my story, or Nico's story, and to be here in a shared space so we can acknowledge all of our heritage. It's so important to think about where you come from, what drives your family or you to move forward or to think about the future, and it's often really good practice to think about the past. Okay? And so for me, I had to ask myself, how do I see myself right now? Before I think or rethink about where I'm from, how do I see myself right now? And this word cloud is very different than it was even 2 years ago, or 5 years ago, or 20 years ago. And the way I see myself is sort of as these many things. I very much feel like I am a Salinas resident, born and raised in Salinas. I see myself as a North Salinas High School graduate, a Viking. I played sports in high school. I traveled, I was an exchange student. And I think of myself as Mexican as well. And I also recognize and acknowledge the indigenous people from where my family come from in Mexico. And so these things are a representation of how I see myself now. But as I said before, the way you see yourself sometimes changes over time and the experiences that you may be having. And so when you think about Mexican traditions, what do you think about? And there are a lot of images that have come across through wherever, social media, media in general, and a lot of them, I'm happy to say now, more people understand or recognize these traditions, like tortillas, or maíz, elote, corn, the folklorico dancing, and our Day of the Dead celebration, and of course chiles, which have a really rich and deep culture in Mexico and in much of Latin America. So to tell you a little bit about my Mexican heritage and where my family is from, I wanted to share the locations of my parents and grandparents and great-grandparents and great-grandparents' birth. And that is a place called Tlatenango de San Jose Roman in Zacatecas and Atolinga. And so I know it's kind of a little bit small, but there's the map. And it is located in the central west region of Mexico. And you see to the south of us is the state of Jalisco. Jalisco's capital is Guadalajara. And Guadalajara within Mexico is known as the Catholic and cultural center or capital of Mexico. It is the capital of mariachis and of Mexican cowboy lifestyle. And the reason that is because of the terrain and the geography of the area. Okay, so there's lots of ranches and cowboys and areas like that. And so the people around there have a really strong cultural identity associated with living on a ranch and having farm animals and having that type of life. And the Catholic center is Guadalajara. And so a lot of folks identify as Catholic there, and it has a very large Catholic population. However, in the history of Mexico, it is an atheist state after the revolution, about 100 and so years ago. Okay, so it's very interesting in terms of identity that the entire country does not recognize a religion, but you still have such strong identities with being Catholic. And also, just to let you know, pre-Columbian history for Tlatenango, it was one of the Gashgan's religious centers and fortifications. It is not a big place. So it's very interesting to know the rich and deep history of a town. And I wanted to show you the center. This is La Plaza. And many Latin American cultures, including that of Europe, have sort of city centers or plazas. And Mexico's no different. And so in this town, this is the plaza. And you can see the capilla from the church, okay, which was built 1540s. And then the center is a park. And actually my uncle owns that building right there, and he lives there even right now. So my family has been there for at least 300 years in the same place. With that same last name, Guarani, which is my maiden name. Okay, and so here on this side you see the capital of Zacatecas, which is called Zacatecas. So Zacatecas is a place, and it's not near where my family's from. It's all the way in the north. And this capital got famous, and this place got famous because of silver that was discovered shortly after the colonization of Mexico. And this here is just in a museum, and it has some tools that folks used to mine silver. Now, it is not a very happy, positive history, and we actually share a little bit of that history of discovering something valuable in the ground here in California, because we had the gold rush. It was very similar in this place. In the 1540s, when they realized that there was so much silver, Spain thought we really need to change what we're doing in this region. And so they really wanted to pull more soldiers and pull Aztecs to come and make sure that this region was conquered. The Caxcanes are the indigenous people of that area. They are not Aztecs. They were not builders of temples, okay? And so they made sure, they spent about 12 years fighting the people in this area to gain control of those silver mines in the north. And outside of southern Latin America, it is the largest silver depository in the Americas. And it remains so. Okay, so that's some history of the place where my family's from. And to show you another map of the area, here is the map of Mexico. And Zacatecas, actually the word got cut off here. It is the yellow area right up top. Okay, so you see where it is located. And it's giving you a list of what the indigenous tribes are for that area. One thing that we forget about often that's really interesting is how diverse any space is. Whether you're in the Americas or even in Europe, any continent in the world actually has quite a large diversity of peoples. They may share in a lot, but they have a lot of distinctions too. And Mexico is no different, right? So you have several tribes in this area. They all identify as Chichimeca, okay? Those are nomadic indigenous people of that area. So here are just some pictures of what they look like, because there are differences and people have a lot of pride in those distinctions on what's different from one indigenous group to another. So I wanted to be able to share those with you. Okay, so the history of Mexico also includes colonization, right? That's how it became to be called Mexico, because of the Spanish conquistadores and their arrival into Mexico. And so, just like there are indigenous roots, we also have European roots. And for my family, those European roots are actually in Spain. And there is a town called Guarani in Spain. So our family does go back quite a bit. We are on the western side of northwestern Spain. And it is in an area known as Galicia, and it is very close to Portugal. So it is unusual. One, it's not typical Spanish last name. Most people don't hear that too often, Guarani. And it's also not very typical to have an actual village or town named after your last name. But I've never been here. But my sister, my older sister was an exchange student to Spain, was able to get a little information about the town. But what is different here is you have the location of Spain, you have a European structure, you have, at this time, kings and queens and that system. You're very, very different in their type of traditional foods. And I wanted to be able to share that with you. So that is the core of what I learned growing up about my background. And it was the extent of my parents' knowledge and my grandparents' knowledge. And so I didn't really have a reason to think beyond that. And since our town in Tatenango has Bugarins there since at least the 17th century, that was a story. It's pretty straightforward. Then this whole genealogy thing happened. And so I thought, what if I actually try to find out what my genealogy is, separate from heritage? And it's so interesting, right? Because here I have still the dominant blood mixture, 38% from that region of indigenous heritage or blood. And then out of nowhere, I have some North American and then indigenous Bolivian and Peruvian blood. Very little, 1%. But together, that's 40% from the Americas. And then Spain, Portugal, and Basque. So those of you that may know a little bit about Spanish history, Spain was not all the same type of people that spoke just one language. There are a bunch of different types of people. And Galicia, the region, has its own culture. And there's also different languages that were spoken in Spain. Basque is a culture in Spain, and they also have their own language. And so, to my surprise, I found that I had some Portuguese and Basque blood in my somewhere. Can't be the last 300 years. Because that's what our family would have said so. So it makes you think, what is heritage really? And where are you from really? The other surprising thing was North African, Jewish, Ireland, 3%. Mexicans and Irish people have a lot in common, I would say, and I'm for that for sure. And then the random is down here, Sweden and Denmark and Germanic people. And interestingly enough, I was an exchange student in high school, and I started learning German, and I had that as a major in college. And then in college, I began learning Danish, and I was an exchange student to Copenhagen. So then I thought, where in the history were these folks mixing together? Because that's the only way you can get to this point. And as you go into, I'm not going to go into that history. That's another really fun class in history. But you can learn about people's movements in Europe and the world. And you have to start asking myself, when did this happen? How many hundreds of years ago? Was it a Viking that arrived in Spain? Probably, maybe, I don't know. It could be many different things. And then Jewish and Irish, if I had the time and the resources, I would go all into this. But I just discovered this year. So I just wanted to share this with you. Because all my life, and I'm in my 40s now, the limit to my heritage or history was Zacatecas. Was okay, there's a place in Spain, and we don't really know much of the details. To boot, the local city records office had a fire, because there's been revolution in Mexico, and then a Cristero rebellion. So once Mexico became an atheist state, people about 15 years later revolted, especially in the Catholic capital, and And this area was a battleground for that. And so a lot of records were burnt, as it happens throughout history in many different places. So you can't always count on having a record of your past or your history. So that'll be a project for another time. Any questions so far about history, Mexico, Spain, human history? Because we all travel and moved around? Okay. I'm sure you're just waiting for later to ask the questions. Okay. So, what does my family look like? Who are they? And so, my grandparents, through my mom's side, the maternal side, are Rosa and Francisco Guarani. This is very typical of that period, the 30s and 40s in Mexico, to have these sort of painting portraits done. So I actually have several aunts and uncles that have something like this, and so our family has this. And usually in our culture, you have sort of these historical pictures passed down to a sibling. And this couple, my grandparents on my mother's side, they had 12 children. And those children lived and grew up on a ranch. And so most of their day was spent doing labor on the ranch. Chickens, cows, other things, milk was involved. And so they had a very different life than most of us. And not all those children survived. But one of them, basically the youngest, she has most of the family pictures. And so she has this picture of my grandparents. And as you can see, they may not traditionally look Mexican, were they made to you? It just depends on how much you've been able to see or learn about Mexican people. Both my parents had colored eyes. My sisters have green and blue eyes. My firstborn was born with colored eyes, very fair skin. Most of my aunts and uncles have colored eyes. My grandfather's dad had bright blue eyes. And you couldn't really tell much about what an indigenous person might look like in your mind. So how does that square with your image of what Mexican folks look like? For me, it's just a reminder of the history of Mexico and how mixed it is and the different stages of migration that occurred, because we didn't just have one group go one time. Like most of the Americas, it was several groups of immigrants from around the world that came to the Americas for different reasons at a different point in time. And so this is just a picture of my parents when they first got married in Zacatecas. They got married in 1969, so they were styling, wearing the hairdo, and the haircut with the sideburns. Okay, so we have, how is it that we came here? And how many of you know what relative first arrived here in the United States? Unless you're indigenous, do you know what family member first came? Is it a parent, a grandparent? Is it many, many generations ago? Right? You're kind of lucky to know, because sometimes history gets lost. People stop sharing it from one generation to the next, and so you're very lucky to know. But for me, my mother's father, the gentleman you saw, his dad came as a bracero. Juan Guarani came in the 1940s in the bracero program, and he worked as a laborer in this area. And then my grandfather came when he was a teenager under the same program, and my mother came as a 16-year-old in that program. And she worked 3 years, never seeing a paycheck. She worked long days, and the paycheck was just handed over to Grandpa until she got married, and then her paycheck was handed over to my dad for many years. And she actually only ever had a 3rd grade education. So she just knew enough to be able to identify herself, know basic alphabet and grammar in Spanish. She actually didn't even know much about Mexican history. My dad had an 8th grade education, private Catholic school. So he had very interesting stories about the nuns and what they did. And when you got in trouble, what that looked like in the 1950s when he grew up. Okay, so very different backgrounds. My dad's family, very different than my mom's family. They had owned land for many generations, and he had land, and it was just a different history story on why folks migrated from Mexico during that time, what was happening with the world economy and cattle. But there was a reason for him to come and work. But for my mom, it was really no choice but to continue being able to support all the other family members back home. My grandfather here, since his dad had come in the 40s, at some point he never returned. They don't know what happened to him. He never came back. They don't know where he died, when he died, and they lived in poverty. And so my mother, they basically had been his older brother, siblings are great, his older brother kicked the family out of the home they were living in after a few years that the dad did not return. And so at that point, my mom was little, with about 3 other siblings, and they had to move into a 1-room, basically barn with the 2 animals that they had for a long time. And so it took a long time to get from not owning anything and not having anything and having a growing family and mouths to feed to trying to actually get your own land and be able to support your family. There's no credit cards back then. Okay, you can't ask people to borrow money back, so I'm not going to let you borrow anything unless you already own something. So you had to have money right then and there. So for that side of the family, poverty was more of a reality than on my dad's side of the family. So different reasons for coming, right? So these are the men that came. This is actually my uncle, who was named after his grandfather Juan. This is the picture on his bracero card. And he did march with Cesar Chavez when he was here in Salinas. And my grandfather, who worked up until he was about 70. And that is my dad working around Sacramento, because in the 70s they had a lot of ag there and tomatoes. So there are at least 3 generations of farm laborers in my family. Okay? And so what is the Bracero program? It's basically because during World War II, like with women, not enough labor to keep industries going in the United States, so they had to think creatively. In addition to asking women to go and work in the factories, they also had to source laborers for agriculture. And so they had an agreement with Mexico that allowed them to send laborers here. And it was legal, they were here legally. And so Salinas has a very strong connection and history with this because of the lettuce and ag industry that really started here in the 1930s. That refrigerated train car changed the world for Salinas. Okay, and so I wanted to show you this because that history is not that long ago, and it wasn't a very pleasant one for a lot of people. People were upset about things as this program evolved. And during that time, at some point, you have disagreements about labor, and people felt empowered to use violence or coercion with the group of laborers. And so my uncle was part of that when they sought a lot of aggression towards laborers for wanting to have labor rights. And this is a time where you would hear stories, and these stories are passed down in my family, where day laborers mean you show up that day and say, hey, I can work today. How much are you paying? And they say this much for this much work. And you work, and then at the end of the day, the person changes their mind on what the arrangement is. And instead of actually paying you what they said, they pay you whatever they're going to pay you. And so that can be very difficult for folks that are trying to support families and have sort of a reliable source of income. It does oversimplify the labor situation, but it's just an example of why rules needed to change about how people work. And so we did have Cesar Chavez, He was here, he did walk here, and he was arrested at the Monterey County Jail, which is not too far from the house that I grew up in. And eventually, the labor laws did change. Okay? And so these are just some pictures to remind us of our own history here, and everyone and everything that's involved. The strike, Cesar Chavez being here, the strike that was specific to us, right, this area, and just knowing that it's part of our history. And for many people, these are their grandparents or uncles or great aunts or uncles that were part of this. So how do you establish community? I've only been to Guatemala like 4 times in my life, but somehow I still feel connected there, but I only know my immediate relatives. And Spain I've been to, but before I even knew about Guarani, I was in another part of Spain visiting, so I wasn't even there, so I can't even say that that town has any sort of connection to me other than the last name. So how do you build community, right? And my mom, she wasn't born here. My grandfather, my great-grandfather were first generation, right? So you build community first through family, and then through your neighbors, and then through many other really great places. And so these are some really old pictures, even though they're only from the 80s, but for you guys it's like ancient. But so we have my siblings and my cousins, and I'm in all these pictures. My favorite is my hairdo from 1991, where I cut all my hair off, and I have really curly hair, and I still have really big glasses. That's that one over there. We're standing next to an exchange student from Japan. Before we moved to North Salinas, we were in East Salinas, or the Alisal community, and we hosted exchange students from around the world. I was very young, and we were still very, I guess, modest is not the word, not poor, but. So we had rice and beans and tortillas pretty regularly, but we also had exchange students from Japan, or Portugal, or France living in our house with us, and those are my 2 older sisters, and my older brother, and that's me, and that's my younger brother. And so, by the time we moved, this exchange student, we had developed a really great relationship. He would come and visit us during his vacation time in Japan, about 2 more years after he finished his exchange year. And he would call us all the time, and so we welcomed people that were not related to us into our home, and we made them part of our family. For neighbors, here in this picture right here is just a bunch of neighborhood kids. Half of them I don't really remember too well, but the other half I do. But we would just hang out in the front yard in the grass all the time. Never home. We get home from school, drop our stuff, and head right back outside. We hardly hung out inside at all. We wanted to be playing with the neighbors and other kids. And so these kids have all grown up. 1 or 2 died from gang violence at a very young age, which is really sad because that neighborhood changed quite a bit by the time we got to the late 80s. And we had pretty strong gang presence there. But these relationships carry you, and you remember very simple things. And if I were to describe going outside and playing with my neighbors and friends, it'd probably be the same story no matter where you are in the world. So, I was very lucky to also be an exchange student. My eldest sister did that year, and she did a year in Spain, so I signed up to go to Switzerland. Why Switzerland? Because, one, I was kind of a nerd back in high school, and I already knew that Switzerland had 4 official languages. And we were having a really hard time talking about multilingual learning in public schools in California. So I wrote, I applied for a national grant and a local one, and I got one to go explore national identity in a country that has 4 official languages versus this one here. And I got it, I won both of them. So it made it attainable, it made it affordable, and I was so lucky. This is the class of sophomores. I was a senior, but my German was so bad. They're like, don't bother the seniors that are trying to get ready for college with your bad German and California. So they stuck me with the students that were second-year students. And this is a Kantonsschule, so they are practicing to go to college. There's no other option, you're gonna go to college. They have a different system. You decide earlier if you're gonna become a professional, go to college, or if you're gonna do a technical track or a vocational one. And they were incredible. They took me in and they treated me as one of their own, even though I was older. And also, interestingly enough, you do this at school, hopefully with your friends, but they're supposed to be teaching in High German. Not that it really helped me too much because my High German was not that good, but they speak Swiss German. That's their language. High German is the official language, but they don't identify with that, not culturally. It's Swiss German. And there was this one history teacher that just refused to speak in High German. He wanted to speak in Swiss German all the time. And my classmates would argue with him all the time about, why aren't you speaking in High German? And I sometimes don't know if it was really for me because they like arguing, because I can get that from, you can distract your teacher for a good minute if you're arguing with them, but they really tried to make sure I felt comfortable and that I had a chance at understanding what was going on in the class. So it was really great. Then, that's my host dad, Izo, teacher. He worked at a technical school. He was really great at languages. He traveled through Eastern Europe in the 70s in a Volkswagen van, and he told me all those stories, which was really cool. And then, this is another family I lived with. They did a second exchange program, and they were in the city of Bern. Also, the father was an instructor at the National Ag School. And so they lived on campus, sort of kind of like how you have it here, where you have a person living right next door. And so they were wonderful. The eldest was studying to be a pilot, the other one I think was gonna be a lawyer, and I forget, she was gonna get married the next year. But they were wonderful, and they took me around Bern, and they really opened up their hearts and their home. And then here in the middle, you guys have service learning, right? You kind of volunteer a few hours. Well, in Switzerland, in this canton, your second year, you have to do 2 weeks straight of live-in service with the local industry. And most of the cantons, the industry is farming. So all my classmates had to be sent to a farm for 2 weeks. You lived there for 2 weeks, you got Sunday off, and you worked Monday through Saturday. And the director asked me, he's like, you're American and from California. All the other exchange students said, no thank you, and they go travel Europe. So well, you're very lucky, I'm a poor American from California, and I got nowhere to travel. And they said they would pay us a daily stipend of like 20 Swiss francs, and we couldn't work, so I was like, yeah, I'll do it. And so I was very lucky that he sent me to his friend's farm, who was the former agriculture minister of Switzerland, and he grew grapes for wine and apples. So I did not have to go work on a farm with cows. Any of you know what that's like? It is not picking apples or rocks on the floor. You're using a shovel, and you're doing other things. That is not delightful, okay? So I knew I got lucky. I got lucky because I did get to visit a classmate at a farm nearby, and oh, he was miserable. And so this is just very unique experience. My host family, they get like 2 months of vacation, paid vacation a year, and they were gonna go on vacation. And again, I had no money, so I wasn't gonna go with them. It was just my host parents. And my host dad's like, what are we gonna do with you for a week? I'm like, I don't know, I can just stay here at your house all by myself. And they're like, no. And so he signed me up to go with the state youth club. That was for the vocational students. Vocation, they are studying to be farmers, hairdressers, kindergarten teachers, very little High German, less English. And he said, I'll pay for your ticket, you can go with them for a week and go ski for a week. And he let me borrow his gear. We are not the same height, and if you know about skiing, that kind of matters with the boots and the skis. But anyways, they took me in, and it was the funnest week I've ever had. And the language, it just wasn't an issue. It just wasn't. I mean, by then, 5 months into being there, I knew a little bit more German or Swiss German, but we just hung out, and we were in a cabin and got to go to the snow every day. It's right by this wonderful place called Vows, which was just built, super gorgeous, and they had a community day, so we got to go and visit because it was affordable, and they let us non-Pashi people hang out for a day, and we did, and it was really great. So I developed a community abroad, and none of these people are related to me. They don't share my cultural background. A few things, farming a little bit, but I was able to connect with them in all these different environments, whether I'm in school or outside, and so it was really impactful and opened my eyes to how community and families really work in the broader sense. And lastly, because I think we're good on timer, how did I even get to college when my mom had a third grade education, my grandparents and great-grandparents didn't have an education, my dad, sort of. Well, this wonderful lady, both of these women, my mom and this teacher in high school who's not my teacher, she was my sister's teacher. And she actually had traveled abroad and lived in Spain, and she encouraged my sisters to pursue college. But my dad said, no. You are women, just become a secretary somewhere. Graduate from high school, don't make this complicated for me or your mom, don't go to college. And so my sisters, and I'm 7 years old, my sisters are telling my mom, and they're telling the teacher that dad won't let them go to college. And so she, who's married to a lawyer in Salinas, does not live in East Salinas, said, you know what, I'm gonna go and I'm gonna have dinner with your family at your home, and I'll talk to your dad for you. And so she came into Acosta Plaza in East Salinas, and she had dinner with our family, and she spoke Spanish. And she convinced my dad to let my sisters go to college. They were great students, super smart, and they had been accepted to Princeton and Williams. And how can they not go? He didn't care it was Princeton or Williams. It was just college, and plus it was far away. So it was gonna be a burden. But she convinced him to let them go, and my dad said yes, but he would not help them. So no rides to the airport, no tuition assistance, don't ask for help. But because he had a respect for educators and teachers, and the teacher went to the home, remember he went to school with Catholic nuns. You don't want those nuns saying nothing about you to your family or your village, so you had a really high regard for educators, so she requested this. She said it's a recommendation, so he wanted to follow it, but he wasn't going to support it. And so at 7, I saw my sisters and my mom really fight for them to be able to go to college. And so what did that do for me? When you see someone else doing it, you kind of think maybe I can do it too. Sometimes whether it's good or bad. But in this case, it was good. So at a very young age, I said, maybe I can go to college too. And so my mom pushed, and this meant during these years, since my dad was not helping them, and they had to fly back and forth, New Jersey, San Jose, San Francisco, they had 2 jobs at school, and it also meant that we had to work extra. So at about 9, 10 years old, I lived with my mom, and we cleaned houses on Saturdays. During the summers and spring break, I picked raspberries and strawberries, and we would send care packages to them and whatever money we could. And we made sure to pick them up from the airport and bring them home. And that's really how I also was able to get my education. And like my sisters, they also got master's degrees. I got a master's degree as well. But it was really because of their experience and this extended family, this community, right, this teacher. And there were other teachers that were very supportive too, that really went beyond being an educator and took it into her own hands to make sure she could make this pitch. And I say this because Miss Donna Vanoy passed away this summer, and she never stopped being an advocate for students and just dedicated her whole life teaching and exchange programs and students in general, so I thank her very much. And finally, I just wanted to share with you different pictures that represent sort of my heritage or where I'm from. And this is a picture of Pancho Villa in Zacatecas, because that's where a big battle was fought that he won. And then, of course, Switzerland, that is Weinfelden. Sorry, that's Frauenfeld, right on the Lake of Constance. That's where I went to Kantonsschule. And then you have more images of indigenous people. This is East Salinas, or the Alisal community. This is me in Copenhagen. That's my mom rocking it in the 70s. That is myself on a horse, my sister, I think on a donkey, and my grandfather. And yeah, that was fun because that donkey wanted to be first all the time, and I kept torturing my sister by going real fast and making the donkey go faster. And that's my grandmother with her daughter, actually, and her grandson, one of the first ones. And again, that is Tatenango, that's me, my parents, and then, of course, the Salinas Valley. And then, of course, affiliations of organizations that I've been part of. Right now, I volunteer with LULAC quite a bit, League of United Latin American Citizens. That was a lot, but that's what I have. So thank you.
There's a lot of information, but that's kind of like the metaphor of the empanada. So I'm going to kick off a question, and then as you hear Aidee answer the question, if you have a question to ask her. The first question is, if we think about our positionality here in Monterey County, right? We're in the salad bowl, we're surrounded by ag fields. What would you want people in this greater community, including students at York, to know about the Hispanic community in Monterey County that is not as apparent as maybe what they think they might know now, if that makes sense?
Yeah. I think, one, laborers from Mexico have been around a long time. In fact, longer than some families here, probably. If you think about 70, 80 years, they've been here a long time already. And their labor's really hard. I think what people forget, even though there's been great advancements in technology and agriculture, it's still manual labor. You are still lifting and bending and spending long hours outside. So I would say that hasn't really changed much in human history. The tools have made it easier, but it's still working the land. And whatever culture you're in, it is still hard work. So you gotta appreciate what that means with what we expect of laborers. Is it okay to take a bathroom break whenever you want to? No, you should be able to, but it's not that easy. Can you do internet shopping while you're at your desk? There is no desk, you can't take that break. Some people do. You're out in the hot sun, you're working really fast. Taking even a call, this is something that we've done a lot in LULAC in the last 20, 30 years, is helping educators understand, like when parents are out in the field, doing a daytime call is a big deal. Calling them out of the line of work, everybody knows, your supervisor knows, and now you're less likely to meet the goals that you have for that day in pulling out, whatever vegetation's growing. So it's harder, their days start much earlier. Sometimes if they're lucky and they do want the extra hours because it pays extra, they may get out late, but what they're available to do after hours, it's a big deal what happens. So if you have those families that are going to games or after school programs or evening stuff, you just have to understand it is physical labor that they're doing all the time. And another thing too, which my mom and my grandpa would say, because Carmel, the drive from Castroville to Carmel, they picked artichokes around there. So before a lot of those nice places were built, they still grew vegetation and people still worked it. Any other questions? question. First, it makes me over-friendly to foreigners. We are a huge tourist location, and I couldn't help it for so many years when I hear like Germans talking, like, oh, hello. So I want to say hello, but I think it's understanding that people come from different places, and you can have very intense differences, but how you get along is the same. Human interaction, where you make friends here, like when you think about college in a new environment, you're gonna make friends there. Different people from different places, you join a new club, or you do something new, or you have an experience somewhere, it's not gonna be a bunch of people that are totally different from you. You're gonna connect with them, because these people, I really didn't understand the language. And I was able to connect, and also the food and their traditions. Like, I went to a party, and they said like young people, and they had like where you're supposed to sit at the table. And I'm like, you can't just sit anywhere? No, you're supposed to sit right there. So they figure out a way to make you welcome. So I think knowing that I'm not afraid of people with differences, and I want to make other people that may feel different in a moment, I want to make them feel welcome. Great question.
Let's give Aidee another big round of applause.
So please join us for the second part of this forum at lunchtime. We'll be in the commons with the salsa instructor and some empanadas. We'll also hang around a little bit after this if you have any questions directly.